Learn English through story. The Silent Blackmail. The first letter arrived on a Wednesday, folded neatly inside an unmarked envelope. No return address, no indication of the sender. Just a single sheet of cream-colored paper with 3 words printed in precise serif font. I know everything. Eleanor Whittaker stood in her sunlit kitchen, the letter held between her trembling fingers. Outside, the early spring air whispered through the oak trees, lighting her quiet suburban street. The world moved on as if nothing had changed. But inside Eleanor's chest, her heart pounded against her ribs like a desperate prisoner. She had spent years burying the past, cementing it under layers of deception and careful choices. Now, with those 3 words, it threatened to surface. Her husband, Michael, was in the living room, absorbed in the morning news, oblivious to the shift that had just occurred in his wife's world. Their life was stable, even enviable, a beautiful home, a teenage daughter with a promising future, and a reputation Eleanor had meticulously built. She was respected in the community, involved in charity work, and known for her composure. But someone knew what she had done. She reread the letter, searching for clues, but there was nothing else. No threats, no demands, just the knowledge of her secret. She crumpled the paper in her palm, glanced over her shoulder, and slid it into the pocket of her cardigan. She needed time to think. She needed to know who had sent it. And, most of all, she needed to make sure they never sent another. Eleanor pressed the crumpled letter deeper into her cardigan pocket, her fingers tightening around the fabric as though she could squeeze the truth out of it. She could hear Michael shifting in his recliner, the rustling of newspaper pages and the occasional sound of a coffee cup meeting the glass tabletop. Their life was structured, predictable, safe. At least, it had been. The knowledge that someone out there held a secret from her past sent a cold shiver up her spine. She had spent years ensuring that particular truth would never resurface, burying it beneath layers of careful choices, strategic silences, and a relentless dedication to appearing unblemished in the eyes of the world. A blackmail attempt. That was the obvious conclusion. But it unsettled her that the note contained no demands, just a declaration, a simple, calculated warning. I know everything. She forced her expression into its usual mask of poise and walked into the living room, her voice carefully even. Michael, I'm heading out for a bit. Need anything from the store? Her husband barely looked up from the business section of the paper. No, I think we're good. Everything okay? Of course. She was a practiced liar, but she still hated how easily it slipped off her tongue. Once outside, she let the fresh air sting her skin, hoping it would bring clarity. She slid into her car and locked the doors, unfolding the letter again with slow, deliberate fingers. The paper trembled slightly as she smoothed it out. Who would send something like this? More importantly, who could? She mentally sifted through her past, through the faces and names that had been left behind. Was it someone she had wronged? Someone who had been watching, waiting for the perfect moment. There was only one way to find out. She drove toward the city, her hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. Her destination wasn't the store, but rather an old friend or, more accurately, an old accomplice. Bridget Monroe. Bridget had been the only other person who knew what had happened that night. All those years ago. The only other person Eleanor had trusted with the weight of her secret. If this letter was truly a threat, then she needed to confirm whether Bridget had received one too. Because if she hadn't, that meant Eleanor was the only target. And that was far more terrifying. As Eleanor drove toward Bridget Monroe's townhouse, her thoughts swirled in a chaotic storm. It had been years since they last spoke. Their friendship had faded. Not out of bitterness, but out of necessity. Some secrets required silence, even between those who shared them. The past wasn't something they discussed. It wasn't something they even acknowledged. But now, with that ominous letter burning in her pocket, Eleanor had no choice but to break the silence. Her grip tightened on the wheel as she turned onto Bridget's quiet street. It was a charming neighbourhood, lined with well-kept homes and manicured gardens. A perfect place for someone like Bridget, who had always been meticulous about appearances. Eleanor pulled into the driveway and took a deep breath before stepping out of the car. The crisp morning air did nothing to cool the heat rising in her chest. She wasn't just nervous, she was afraid. Afraid of what she would find. She rang the doorbell, listening to the chime echo inside. Footsteps approached, slow and measured. When the door opened, Bridget stood there, her face momentarily frozen in surprise before she masked it with a polite smile. "Eleanor," she said, her voice smooth but cautious. "This is unexpected." Eleanor forced a smile. "I was in the neighbourhood. Thought I'd drop by." Bridget hesitated but then stepped aside. "Come in." The house was just as Eleanor remembered, minimalist, stylish, and painfully precise. Every cushion, every piece of decor seemed placed with careful intention. They sat in the living room, a thin tension between them. Bridget crossed her legs, studying Eleanor with a sharp gaze. "So, what brings you here after all this time?" Eleanor reached into her pocket and pulled out the letter, unfolding it with deliberate slowness before sliding it across the glass coffee table. Bridget's expression remained unreadable as she picked it up. But the moment her eyes landed on those 3 words, her fingers tightened around the edges of the paper. A long silence stretched between them before Eleanor finally spoke. "Did you get one too?" Bridget exhaled sharply and set the letter down. "No." A chill spread through Eleanor's chest. If Bridget hadn't received a letter, then that meant, "It's just me," she whispered. Bridget leaned forward, her voice lower now. "You sure this isn't some kind of prank?" Eleanor shook her head. "No one else knows." Bridget didn't argue because they both knew it was true. "So what do we do?" Eleanor asked. Bridget tapped her nails against the glass table, thinking. "First, we figure out who sent this. If they wanted money, they would have asked for it." Eleanor nodded. That was what disturbed her the most. There was no demand, no threat, just knowledge. Bridget leaned in, her voice like a blade. "And if they know the truth, Eleanor, we may have to stop them before they decide to use it." The words sent a shudder through Eleanor, but she didn't disagree. Whoever was behind this had made a mistake. They had underestimated how far she was willing to go to keep her past buried. Eleanor sat back, the weight of Bridget's words pressing down on her like an iron hand. "We may have to stop them before they decide to use it." It was a chilling statement, but Eleanor wasn't naive enough to dismiss it. The past had already proven that when people were backed into a corner, they did whatever it took to survive. And now, once again, she found herself facing a threat that could undo everything. Bridget leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Let's think logically. If someone truly knows what happened, then they either witnessed something or found evidence. And if they wanted to expose us, they would have done it outright." She tapped the letter. "But they haven't. That means they want something." Eleanor swallowed. "Then why didn't they say what it was?" Bridget's lips pressed into a thin line. "Because they want you to stew in fear. They want you to know they're in control." Eleanor hated the idea that some nameless, faceless person was out there playing with her life, like a cat with a mouse. It made her stomach churn. Bridget studied her, eyes sharp. "You need to be careful, Eleanor. If they contact you again, don't react. Don't let them see that you're afraid." Eleanor let out a slow breath. "And if they don't contact me again?" Bridget's silence spoke volumes. They both knew the answer. If the silence stretched too long, it meant the blackmailer wasn't finished. It meant they were planning their next move. And that was more terrifying than the letter itself. That night, Eleanor barely slept. Every creak of the house, every shift of the wind outside sent a spike of anxiety through her. She checked the locks 3 times before finally forcing herself to lie still. By morning, exhaustion clung to her, but she forced herself into her usual routine. She greeted Michael with a strained smile, packed their daughter Lily's school lunch, and left for work as if nothing was wrong. But something was very wrong. When she arrived at her office sleek, modern space in a downtown law firm, she found another envelope waiting on her desk. No return address. No markings. Her heart pounded. She locked the door before picking up the envelope, fingers trembling. Tearing it open, she pulled out another single sheet of cream-colored paper. This time, there were more words. You're wondering what I want. You'll find out soon. Eleanor felt the floor shift beneath her. This wasn't just a game. It was a hunt, and she was the prey. Eleanor gripped the letter so tightly that the edges curled under the pressure of her fingers. The weight of the words seeped into her bones, a silent, creeping dread that made her limbs heavy. You're wondering what I want. You'll find out soon. She had no way of knowing when soon would be. Hours, days, a week. The uncertainty was a slow, insidious poison. She took a shaky breath, forcing herself to think. Who could be doing this? It had to be someone from the past, someone who knew about that night. But how and why now? She needed to be careful. If she reacted too quickly, she could play right into the blackmailer's hands. But if she waited too long? She pressed her fingers to her temple, trying to steady herself. A knock on her office door made her jolt. She stuffed the letter into her desk drawer and took a deep breath. Come in. Her assistant, a young woman named Mara, stepped inside, holding a small stack of legal documents. Morning, Mrs. Whitaker. I have the files you requested. Eleanor forced a smile. Thank you, Mara. Just leave them there. Mara hesitated. Are you okay? You look a little pale. Eleanor waved a hand dismissively. Just didn't sleep well. Mara nodded and left the room, but Eleanor could feel her lingering suspicion. She needed to be more careful. If people started noticing her distress, it could unravel everything even faster. She turned her attention back to her desk, forcing herself to focus on work. But no matter how many times she reread contracts or reviewed case files, her mind kept drifting back to that letter. You'll find out soon. She was terrified of what soon would bring. That evening, Eleanor drove home with her nerves on edge, her eyes flicking to the rearview mirror more times than necessary. Was she being followed? She couldn't tell. Paranoia was setting in, curling its cold fingers around her mind. When she pulled into the driveway, she sat in the car for a moment, trying to gather herself. Then her phone buzzed. A message. Her breath caught as she picked it up. The number was unknown. Check your mailbox. She stared at the screen, her pulse pounding. Slowly, she stepped out of the car and walked toward the mailbox. Her hands felt like they belonged to someone else as she pulled it open. Inside, there was a small black envelope. She hesitated before reaching for it. Her skin prickled with unease. She carried it inside, locking the door behind her before carefully opening it. Inside was a single photograph. The moment she saw it, her breath left her in a ragged gasp. It was a picture of her, but not from today. It was from that night, the night she and Bridget had sworn to bury. She felt the room tilt, her heart slamming against her ribs. Someone had proof, and they were letting her know that her time was running out. Eleanor's hands trembled as she stared at the photograph. It was unmistakable. The grainy quality didn't obscure the truth. It was her. Her face, her posture, the unmistakable fear in her eyes, captured in a frozen moment from a past she had worked so hard to forget. The night that had changed everything. She pressed a hand against her chest, willing her heart to slow. Her breath was coming too fast, too shallow. The room tilted slightly. She needed to think. Her first instinct was to shred the photo, burn it, erase it from existence. But she knew that wouldn't change anything. Someone had taken it. Someone still had the original. Someone was watching. A new, horrifying thought crept into her mind. What if they weren't just watching now? What if they had been watching her all along? She turned the photo over, half expecting more words scrawled on the back. But it was blank. No message, no instructions. Just the image itself a warning. Her phone buzzed in her hand. Another unknown number. She hesitated before opening the message. You should have told the truth when you had the chance. A violent shudder passed through her. No demands, no instructions, just a reminder of her crime. A punishment looming just out of sight. She clenched her fists, fighting the suffocating wave of panic. She had spent years making sure no one would ever uncover what had happened that night. Yet here she was. Someone knew. Someone had been watching. And they wanted her to understand that she was powerless now. She wasn't in control anymore. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt truly trapped. That night, she barely spoke to Michael. She went through the motions smiling, nodding, pretending everything was normal, but inside, she was unraveling. She barely touched her dinner. When Lily asked if she was okay, Eleanor forced a soft laugh. Just a long day at work. A lie. One of many. When Michael went to bed, she stayed awake, staring at the fireplace as the embers slowly died. She tried to tell herself that everything was going to be fine. That was when the phone rang. The house was silent, the ringing cutting through the darkness like a blade. Eleanor's stomach clenched as she grabbed the phone from the table. Unknown caller. She answered, forcing her voice to be steady. Who is this? Silence. Her pulse roared in her ears. If you think you can scare me. A voice cut through the static. Low, calm, almost amused. You sound afraid, Eleanor. Her breath caught in her throat. The voice was unfamiliar. Distorted, maybe? But whoever it was, they knew her name. She forced steel into her tone. What do you want? A pause, then. I want you to remember. The call ended. Eleanor stood there, gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. Whoever was doing this didn't just want money. They wanted something else. Something far worse. They wanted her to suffer. The next morning, she drove straight to Bridget's house, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her nails dug into her palms. When Bridget opened the door, Eleanor didn't wait for an invitation. She stepped inside, slamming the door shut behind her. Bridget blinked at her. What the hell? Eleanor shoved the photograph into her hands. Someone has proof. Bridget's expression darkened as she studied the image. Slowly, she turned it over, her lips pressing into a thin line when she saw the blank back. Where did you get this? My mailbox. And then Eleanor hesitated. I got a call last night. Bridget's head snapped up. A call. They didn't ask for money. They didn't make any demands. They just told me to remember. Bridget went silent, gripping the photograph so tightly the edges curled. Eleanor's voice lowered. Did you tell anyone? Bridget's eyes flashed with anger. Of course not. Then Eleanor swallowed. Who else could know? Bridget turned away, pacing. There were only two possibilities. Someone had been there that night, someone they never noticed. Or someone had found out afterward. Bridget finally looked at her. We need to figure out who's doing this. Eleanor nodded. And we need to do it before they destroy everything. The tension is escalating, and the psychological unraveling is beginning. I'll continue expanding the story, deepening the suspense, and building the moral stakes. Let me know if you want any specific elements intensified as the plot unfolds. Bridget's hands trembled as she set the photograph down on the coffee table, her nails tapping against the wood. The air in the room felt too still, too thick with unspoken fear. Eleanor watched her carefully, noting the slight twitch in her jaw, the way her fingers clenched and unclenched as if trying to grasp at an invisible thread of control. We need to think this through, Bridget said, finally, her voice low, measured. Eleanor scoffed. Think it through. Someone out there knows, Bridget. They have evidence. They called me. Do you know what they said? She didn't wait for an answer. I want you to remember. Bridget's eyes darkened. They don't want money, Eleanor continued, voice shaking. They don't want to expose us, not yet. They want us afraid. They want us guessing. Bridget inhaled sharply and rubbed her temples, which means they're watching. Eleanor nodded, her stomach twisting at the thought. How long do we wait before they make their next move? Bridget muttered. Eleanor's mind raced. We can't wait. We have to figure out who this is before they do something worse. Bridget's lips pressed into a thin line. You're right. They stared at each other. Two women bound by a shared past that had finally come back to haunt them. Finally, Bridget spoke. We start with the only people who could have known. That night, Eleanor sat in her car outside a small, dimly lit house on the edge of town. Bridget had insisted they split up, cover more ground, reach out to anyone who might have had even the smallest connection to that night. Eleanor hadn't wanted to do this alone, but she had no choice. She stared at the house, her fingers drumming nervously on the steering wheel. It had been years since she had last seen him. She had hoped to never see him again, but now she had no choice. She took a deep breath and stepped out of the car. The air was damp, thick with the smell of rain-soaked earth. Her heels clicked against the pavement as she approached the front door. She hesitated, then knocked. The door opened slightly, revealing a man in his mid-40s with tired eyes and a today-old beard. His gaze flickered with surprise when he saw her. Eleanor. His voice was hoarse, like he hadn't spoken much in a while. Hello, Damon? Damon Fields had been a cop once. A good one. But that was before his career had crumbled, before he had fallen from grace. He had known something back then, suspected, maybe even investigated, but nothing had ever come of it. Still, Eleanor had never trusted that he had let it go. What are you doing here? He asked, leaning against the door frame. She held his gaze. I need to talk to you, inside. He studied her for a moment before stepping back and opening the door wider. She stepped in, feeling the weight of the past settle over her. The living room was small and cluttered, filled with old files, scattered papers, and the unmistakable scent of whiskey. You've been drinking, she noted. Damon smirked. And you're still a good liar. But I won't hold that against you. She stiffened. I need to ask you something. He folded his arms. Go ahead. Eleanor hesitated. Then she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the photograph, setting it down on the coffee table. Damon's expression barely changed, but she caught the slight flicker in his eyes as he glanced at it. Where did you get this? He asked, his voice quieter now. Someone left it for me. Damon exhaled through his nose. And you think I had something to do with it? Eleanor searched his face for any sign of deception. I think you were always too close to the truth. And I need to know if you ever told anyone. Damon leaned back against the couch, running a hand over his jaw. I didn't tell anyone, he said finally. Then who did? She pressed. Damon was silent for a long moment. Finally, he reached over to the side table, grabbing a worn notebook and flipping through it. Then he slid it across the table toward her. She hesitated before picking it up. The pages were filled with names, notes, clues from an investigation, long abandoned. And then, her breath caught in her throat. There, near the bottom of a page, was a name she hadn't expected to see. A name that sent a jolt of fear through her chest. Because if this person had figured out the truth, then Eleanor wasn't just being blackmailed. She was in real, dangerous trouble. Her hands trembled as she turned to Damon. Where is he now? Damon's lips pressed into a thin line. He's been dead for 2 years. The room spun around her. Dead. And yet someone was still sending her threats. Someone who had picked up where he left off. And whoever they weren't going to stop. Eleanor's pulse roared in her ears. This wasn't just blackmail anymore. This was a hunt. And she was running out of time. Bridget's hands trembled as she set the photograph down on the coffee table, her nails tapping against the wood. The air in the room felt too still, too thick with unspoken fear. Eleanor watched her carefully, noting the slight twitch in her jaw, the way her fingers clenched and unclenched as if trying to grasp at an invisible thread of control. We need to think this through, Bridget said, finally, her voice low, measured. Eleanor scoffed. Think it through. Someone out there knows, Bridget. They have evidence. They called me. Do you know what they said? She didn't wait for an answer. I want you to remember. Bridget's eyes darkened. They don't want money, Eleanor continued, voice shaking. They don't want to expose us, not yet. They want us afraid. They want us guessing. Bridget inhaled sharply and rubbed her temples. Which means they're watching. Eleanor nodded, her stomach twisting at the thought. How long do we wait before they make their next move? Bridget muttered. Eleanor's mind raced. We can't wait. We have to figure out who this is before they do something worse. Bridget's lips pressed into a thin line. You're right. They stared at each other. Two women bound by a shared past that had finally come back to haunt them. Finally, Bridget spoke. We start with the only people who could have known. That night, Eleanor sat in her car outside a small, dimly lit house on the edge of town. Bridget had insisted they split up, cover more ground, reach out to anyone who might have had even the smallest connection to that night. Eleanor hadn't wanted to do this alone, but she had no choice. She stared at the house, her fingers drumming nervously on the steering wheel. It had been years since she had last seen him. She had hoped to never see him again, but now she had no choice. She took a deep breath and stepped out of the car. The air was damp, thick with the smell of rain-soaked earth. Her heels clicked against the pavement as she approached the front door. She hesitated, then knocked. The door opened slightly, revealing a man in his mid-40s with tired eyes and a today-old beard. His gaze flickered with surprise when he saw her. Eleanor. His voice was hoarse, like he hadn't spoken much in a while. Hello, Damon. Damon Fields had been a cop once. A good one. But that was before his career had crumbled, before he had fallen from grace. He had known something back then, suspected, maybe even investigated, but nothing had ever come of it. Still, Eleanor had never trusted that he had let it go. What are you doing here? He asked, leaning against the door frame. She held his gaze. I need to talk to you, inside. He studied her for a moment before stepping back and opening the door wider. She stepped in, feeling the weight of the past settle over her. The living room was small and cluttered, filled with old files, scattered papers, and the unmistakable scent of whiskey. You've been drinking, she noted. Damon smirked. And you're still a good liar. But I won't hold that against you. She stiffened. I need to ask you something. He folded his arms. Go ahead. Eleanor hesitated. Then she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the photograph, setting it down on the coffee table. Damon's expression barely changed, but she caught the slight flicker in his eyes as he glanced at it. Where did you get this? He asked, his voice quieter now. Someone left it for me. Damon exhaled through his nose. And you think I had something to do with it? Eleanor searched his face for any sign of deception. I think you were always too close to the truth. And I need to know if you ever told anyone. Damon leaned back against the couch, running a hand over his jaw. I didn't tell anyone, he said finally. Then who did? She pressed. Damon was silent for a long moment. Finally, he reached over to the side table, grabbing a worn notebook and flipping through it. Then he slid it across the table toward her. She hesitated before picking it up. The pages were filled with names, notes, clues from an investigation, long abandoned. And then, her breath caught in her throat. There, near the bottom of a page, was a name she hadn't expected to see. A name that sent a jolt of fear through her chest. Because if this person had figured out the truth, then Eleanor wasn't just being blackmailed. She was in real, dangerous trouble. Her hands trembled as she turned to Damon. Where is he now? Damon's lips pressed into a thin line. He's been dead for 2 years. The room spun around her. Dead. And yet someone was still sending her threats. Someone who had picked up where he left off. And whoever they weren't going to stop. Eleanor's pulse roared in her ears. This wasn't just blackmail anymore. This was a hunt. And she was running out of time. Eleanor sat frozen, staring at Damon. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in on her. He's been dead for 2 years, she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Damon nodded. Car accident. At least, that's what the report said. Eleanor's stomach twisted. You don't believe that? Damon exhaled sharply. I don't believe in coincidences, Eleanor. The man had spent years chasing ghosts, getting to close to things people didn't want uncovered. And then, one night, he just happens to lose control of his car. No witnesses, No real investigation. It was convenient. Eleanor gripped the edges of the notebook. So, if he's dead, then someone else picked up where he left off, Damon finished. A chill ran through her. This wasn't just about that night anymore. It wasn't just about a secret buried in the past. Someone had inherited this blackmail, and they weren't doing it for money. They were doing it for something else. Something worse. Damon studied her. You need to start talking, Eleanor. Tell me exactly what's happening. Eleanor hesitated. She had spent years keeping this buried. She had promised herself she would never speak of it again. But this wasn't just about her anymore. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the black envelope. She placed it on the table next to the photograph. Damon picked it up, his expression hardening as he read the note inside. You're wondering what I want. You'll find out soon. His jaw tightened. This isn't just blackmail. This is psychological warfare. Eleanor swallowed. Then what do they want? Damon leaned forward, his voice low. They want you to break before they finish the job. A shiver ran down her spine. She thought of the phone call. I want you to remember. Whoever was behind this wanted her unraveling piece by piece. They were playing with her. And the worst part? She was falling for it. When Eleanor left Damon's house, the night air felt colder than before. She pulled her coat tighter around herself and glanced around the empty street. It was too quiet. She had spent the past few days feeling like she was being watched. But now it was worse. She knew she was being watched. She forced herself to walk to her car, unlocking the door quickly and sliding inside. She locked the doors and took a shaky breath. She needed to think. Bridget. She had to tell Bridget what she had learned. She reached for her phone, but before she could dial, something caught her eye. A piece of paper. It was stuck under her windshield wiper. Her pulse quickened. Not here, not while she was inside the car. Slowly, cautiously, she opened the door and stepped out. The street was still empty, but that didn't mean she was alone. She reached for the paper with trembling fingers. The handwriting was different from the notes. Before, Messier, Husher ... for words. You took something from me. Her breath hitched. What did that mean? She clutched the paper and scanned the street. Her skin crawled with the feeling that someone was watching, waiting, enjoying the fear tightening around her throat. She jumped back into the car, locked the doors, and started the engine. She needed to get home. But even as she drove, the words burned into her mind. You took something from me. This wasn't just about what had happened that night. This was personal. When Eleanor arrived home, she parked in the driveway and sat in the car for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel. Her house was dark, Michael and Lily already asleep. Safe, she hoped. She didn't know what she was expecting when she stepped inside. Another letter, a shadow lurking in the hallway. But the house was silent. She locked the door behind her and exhaled. Then she walked into the kitchen and reached for a glass of water, trying to steady herself. The clock on the wall ticked softly. Tick, tick, tick. She stared at the note in her hand, running her fingers over the words. You took something from me. Something. Or someone. Her stomach turned as a memory surfaced. A face. A scream. Blood in the dark. No. She pressed a hand to her temple, willing it away. She had spent years burying that night. She couldn't let it come back now. But it was. Piece by piece. And whoever was behind this, they weren't going to stop. The next morning, Eleanor sat across from Bridget at a small cafe, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Bridget leaned forward, her face pale. He's dead. Eleanor nodded. 2 years ago. Bridget shook her head. Then who? Eleanor slid the note across the table. You took something from me. Bridget's fingers hovered over the words, her expression unreadable. Then, without looking up, she whispered, They know about him. Eleanor's blood ran cold. Him. Not just that night, but him. The one thing they'd never spoken of. Not even to each other. Bridget's eyes met hers, fear flickering behind them. What do we do? Eleanor inhaled sharply, her pulse racing. We find out who's behind this. Bridget swallowed. And if we can't? Eleanor stared down at the note. Then she whispered, then we do whatever it takes to survive. The tension is tightening, and the truth is creeping closer. Now, the blackmailer isn't just threatening their past. Crime they know something deeper, something worse. Eleanor sat stiffly in the cafe, her fingers tightening around the edges of the note. The words "you took something from me" felt heavier now. More personal, more dangerous. She looked up at Bridget, whose normally composed expression was cracking. There was fear in her eyes, but beneath it something else, guilt. Eleanor set the note down between them. We agreed never to speak of it. Bridget nodded slowly. And we didn't. But now someone knows, Eleanor whispered. Bridget exhaled sharply, running a hand through her blonde hair. It was supposed to stay buried. She hesitated. I don't understand. If they know, why now? That was the question Eleanor couldn't shake. It had been years. The past had felt locked away, unreachable. Yet here it was, clawing its way back to the surface. Relentless, refusing to let go. We need to retrace our steps, Bridget said. If someone's resurfacing this now, it means there's a trail we didn't cover. Eleanor's throat tightened. You think we missed something? I don't know, Bridget admitted. But someone else clearly does. Eleanor stared out the window, watching the quiet street outside. People walked by, oblivious to the storm brewing inside her. Somewhere, someone was pulling the strings, waiting for her to unravel. We need to go back, she whispered. Bridget stiffened. Back where? Eleanor swallowed. To the place where it happened. Bridget paled. Eleanor, it's the only way. A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Bridget exhaled. Fine, but we do this carefully. Eleanor nodded, but deep down, she knew there was no way to go back to that night without tearing open old wounds. And this time, someone was waiting for them to bleed. That night, Eleanor found herself standing in front of her bedroom mirror, staring at her own reflection. She looked composed, put together, but beneath the surface, she was unraveling. The memories were surfacing in pieces. Shadows in the dark, a muffled scream, the sharp, metallic scent of blood. She closed her eyes, pressing her fingers to her temples. She had spent years locking that night away, but now the past was demanding to be heard. A sudden noise made her jolt. Her phone vibrated on the nightstand. A message. With shaking hands, she picked it up. Unknown number, you're getting close. Her breath hitched. Then another message. A picture. Her heart stopped. It was a photo of her standing outside the cafe with Bridget earlier that day, taken from a distance. Someone had been watching. They weren't just threatening her anymore. They were following her. Eleanor's grip tightened on the phone. She spun toward the window, heart hammering. The street outside was dark, the shadows stretching long under the dim glow of the street lights. Was someone out there right now? Another message came through. Unknown number, go back. Eleanor, remember what you did. Eleanor's stomach clenched. This wasn't just blackmail anymore. This was a warning. And if she didn't listen, she had no doubt there would be consequences. The drive back to the place where it happened felt surreal. Bridget sat in the passenger seat, her hands clasped tightly together. Neither of them spoke. The road stretched ahead, winding toward the outskirts of town, where the world felt quieter, where memories lingered in the silence. Finally, the headlights illuminated the old dirt path. Eleanor stopped the car, staring at the place she had spent years trying to forget. It was abandoned now, overgrown with weeds, the skeletal remains of a house barely visible through the trees. Bridget exhaled shakily. I can't believe we're back here. Eleanor swallowed hard. Neither can I. She stepped out of the car, her heels sinking into the damp earth. The air smelled of rain, of decay, of something long left behind. They walked in silence, the past pressing against them with every step. Then Eleanor stopped. Her breath caught, because there, on the ground, was something that shouldn't have been there. A single, black envelope. Bridget gasped, "No." Eleanor bent down, hands trembling as she picked it up. She turned it over. Her name was written on the front. Slowly, she peeled it open. Inside, a single sheet of paper. She unfolded it, her stomach twisting as she read the words. "I was here that night. I saw what you did." The air left her lungs. Bridget grabbed the paper, her eyes widening. "No, this isn't possible." Eleanor's pulse roared in her ears. Someone had been here. That night. Someone had seen everything. Her vision blurred as the past crashed over her in waves. The struggle, the shouting, the moment of impact, the body hitting the ground, the silence that followed, the decision that had sealed their fate. And now, someone was tearing it all back open. Eleanor's breath shuddered. This wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The psychological tension is escalating. And now Eleanor and Bridget realize they were never truly alone that night. Someone else was there. Someone who has waited years to make them pay. Eleanor stood frozen, the note trembling in her hands. "I was here that night. I saw what you did." Bridget's breathing was uneven beside her. Who could have been here? Eleanor swallowed hard, her mind racing. The night had been dark, the panic overwhelming. They had been so sure, so certain that no one else had been there. But they had been wrong. A sudden rustling in the trees made them both jump. Eleanor spun around, her pulse pounding. "We need to go, now." Bridget didn't argue. They ran back to the car, slamming the doors shut. Eleanor fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking as she started the engine. The headlights cast long shadows over the abandoned house. Then, a figure stepped into the light, a hooded silhouette, still, watching. Eleanor's breath hitched. Bridget whispered, "Oh my God." The figure raised a hand and pointed at them. Eleanor didn't wait. She slammed her foot on the gas, the tires spinning against the gravel as they sped away. Bridget clutched her chest, trying to catch her breath. "Did you see that? They wanted us to know they were there." Eleanor nodded, gripping the wheel. "They're not hiding anymore." Bridget shook her head. They never were. By the time they reached Eleanor's house, neither of them spoke for a long time. The truth sat between them, heavy and unspoken. They had spent years trying to forget, but the past had never really let them go. Bridget finally broke the silence. "We have to figure out who it is." Eleanor inhaled deeply. "I think we already know." Bridget frowned. "What?" Eleanor turned to her, her voice barely above a whisper. "The man we killed. He had a brother." Bridget's face went pale. She hadn't thought about him in years. They had told themselves there was no connection, that no one would come looking for the truth. But he had been looking. All this time. Eleanor reached for her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen. "We need to end this." Bridget stared at her. "How?" Eleanor met her gaze. "By telling the truth." Bridget's breath caught. They had spent years burying it, protecting themselves. But now, the weight of their silence had become their own prison. Bridget exhaled shakily. "If we do this, everything changes." Eleanor nodded. "Maybe that's the point." The next morning, Eleanor and Bridget walked into the police station together. The weight of their secret pressed against them. But with each step, it began to loosen. For years, they had lived in fear, running from a night that refused to stay buried. But the past had caught up to them, and now they were finally facing it. They sat down across from the officer, their hands clasped together. Eleanor took a deep breath. And then, she told the truth. Moral of the story: the burden of a secret is often heavier than the truth itself. Lies may shield us for a time, but they also imprison us in fear and guilt. Only by facing our past, by owning our mistakes, can we truly be free. Eleanor and Bridget spent years running, but in the end, redemption wasn't found in silence. It was found in honesty. And though the truth had its price, it also brought peace.